In this presentation, I will walk you through the logic behind Amasia's investment thesis with lots and lots of facts. And our thesis, just to remind you, is focused on fighting the climate crisis and getting to a sustainable planet. This is a summary of what I have to say. Many of us, but not all of us, know that climate change is real and that we need to act now. The changes that have been proposed and discussed are not enough. Only behavior change at scale is going to get us to the right point. And I'll end this presentation briefly with our framework, our behavior change framework that helps guide all of our investments. But first, the science, the facts. Our planet is absolutely in crisis, and there are several important markers of that fact. First, the carbon dioxide or CO2 content in the atmosphere is the highest it has been in 800,000 years. What does that mean? High CO2 levels have serious consequences for the global temperature, which is rising dramatically. In fact, the 10 warmest years on record are all from the 21st century. The warming is causing ice to melt around the globe, which is raising sea levels a little over 3 millimeters per year. That may not seem like much, but it's actually the fastest rate in 6,000 years. As you likely know, the Earth has gone through many dramatic changes in climate over its lifetime. This one is different because it is unquestionably human activity that is causing it. For one, the state of natural factors that influence climate would actually suggest a cooler climate. This may seem like a complicated slide, but the message is simple. Fluctuations in human activity. The slide shows the separation between human and just normal planetary, natural planetary activity. The fluctuations in human activity line up almost perfectly with the warming we are seeing. Humans have emitted as much CO2 during the 41 years between 1970 and 2011 as they did during the 220 years before that. And it's not just carbon dioxide that we are emitting at high levels, which you can see on the right-hand side. You can see another example of the data. But if you look at the chart, there are a number of so-called greenhouse gases that are causing our atmosphere to warm, of which carbon dioxide just is the most prominent. On the path that we are on now, the planet will warm between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius this century, and that will have catastrophic consequences for humanity. These costs are economic. These are some headlines. And they'll cause trillions of dollars in damages and potentially destroy our ability to reduce and prevent financial risk through insurance. These costs are social. Again, a few headlines. And they could create millions of refugees from extreme weather and cause food and water shortages and conflict. Climate change even threatens our ability to live healthy lives. These are some more headlines. Climate change is already, the health cost is measured in human deaths, 250,000 victims a year. Bottom line, the situation is absolutely dire. Scientists on the forefront of the climate fight say that in order to avoid the worst consequences, we need to prevent warming over 2 degrees Celsius. In order to even come close to this goal, we will have to reduce net emissions to zero by 2050. We are reaching a point of no return. We need dramatic action, and we need it now. Now that I've painted this terrifying picture for you, and I apologize for doing that, but it's important you know the facts, let's talk about the strategies being used currently to see if we can change our fate. First, national governments are taking measures like the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. the largest commitment by the world's governments thus far to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Compliance is binding but flexible, and targets are set domestically. The United States has promised to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, and other countries have made similar commitments. Guess what? The actions supposedly spurred by the Paris Climate Accord are simply not happening fast enough to meet the goals set in that accord. Now, corporations, which sometimes have the status and reach of nation states or super nation states, corporations have also promised to make changes to reduce their contribution to global emissions. But these corporate pledges have produced extremely mixed results. Many rely heavily on purchasing carbon offsets to reduce net emissions rather than reducing their output, and these offsets do not always have the promised impact. To just read the stat here, Shell would need to reforest an area the size of Spain to get emissions in line with Paris Accord goals. Just setting aside the details, bottom line is these pledges are still not enough to keep us below a 2 degrees Celsius increase. This provides a little more detail on the gap. Yes, private and public climate finance have taken off, but it's nowhere near enough. We have to touch on the trend of the moment, which is ESG investing, as it's called, environmental, social, or societal and governance factors being incorporated into how capital is deployed, and it's grown as a response to the climate threat. Assets under management in, quote, sustainable funds have grown nearly tenfold in the last 11 years. But we need to know how much capital is really dedicated to ESG and how effectively is it being used. Some estimates suggest that as much as $100 trillion have been dedicated to ESG investing. But it is not clear at all how well these investments are performing in economic terms, or even what metrics to use to assess their performance. Unfortunately, this means that the ESG movement as it stands currently may not be effective at fighting the climate crisis. Sorry, though I am and we are to say that. So despite all the talk from both the public and private sectors about climate action, it appears that we're just not on the right track to prevent the worst consequences of climate change. There's hope. The pandemic lockdowns provided an important data point for our fight against the climate crisis. First half of 2020, which seemed like a really long time ago, was marked by the largest emissions decrease in history. The drop, as you can see on the left side chart, was simply staggering. Comparable to the reductions needed each year to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The pandemic forced, as I think we all know, a digital migration of sorts for those of us who could digitally migrate. And that had a dramatic impact on the emissions associated with our daily routines. We are coming now to the meat of my point in this entire presentation. Moving a physical activity such as a meeting into the virtual sphere has a staggering effect on carbon emissions. Of course, you give up some things, but you get back the planet. Although challenging for many people, this behavior change was more effective than all the international agreements and corporate pledges we discussed. I want to emphasize and re-emphasize this, as it is our fundamental point. This behavior change at scale is the only thing that has been shown to work. We wrote our thesis essay in 2019 before the pandemic. The pandemic, this is not a great way to say it, but I'm going to say it. The pandemic essentially gave us conclusive A/B test results. Unfortunately, the gains made in those early months of the pandemic were not sustainable and emissions have rebounded. And so the key question is, how can behavior change at scale be made sticky? That is the question we will tackle now. Before we can answer it, we need to understand where our current behaviors come from. Three key factors that have shaped our status quo: the use of cheap fossil fuels, the explosion in population, and our culture of overconsumption. We all know about one. Many of us occasionally think about two. It's really three that's the killer, literally, and that requires more thinking. But first, our use of fossil fuels. Since the Industrial Revolution, advances in technology have dramatically improved our quality of life. The vast majority of these innovations to transportation and infrastructure are reliant on non-renewable fossil fuels. The growing use of fossil fuels was also driven by the explosion in population. In the last 100 years, our population has grown fivefold. Fossil fuel consumption, just so we all know, grew tenfold. But even more than population, our reliance on fossil fuels has been driven by the culture of overconsumption, which originated, sadly, I should say it, in the United States, but has now spread to other developed countries. I would urge anyone watching or reading this presentation to focus in your daily life on the statistic of overconsumption per capita. What does that mean? Where did this come from? In our culture, in modern Western culture, which is now spread through the world, material possessions determine our identity and status. The collection of possessions needed to fit into that identity and status is ever enlarging. Dr. Julia Chor, who is actually an advisor to Amasia, has explained the backstory to this. No deep science in what she writes. Well, there's a lot of science, but not molecular science. It's deep social science because the issues here are societal. Our expenditures on non-necessities, our residential energy use, and our vehicle ownership have all increased dramatically in the last 50 years. Philosopher René Girard, who's kind of the philosopher du jour in Silicon Valley startup circles for a wholly different set of reasons. He called this urge mimetic desire, but it can also be described very simply. We think what will make us happiest is what our peers have. With the rise of globalized media and advertising, this culture is spreading all over the world. But I want to make a very important set of points here. Overconsumption is not made equal around the world. Please focus on the right-hand slide, not the left-hand slide, which gets a lot of attention, left hand of the slide. The right-hand slide is the per capita number. That's a crucial number. So that's pretty uneven across the world. It's also really uneven across income groups, which is very interesting. It's sort of obvious, but it's interesting. It is the most affluent 10% who are using the most resources and therefore most need to reduce their consumption. There's one thing to be taken away from this whole talk. That is it. The rich need to consume much, much less. And the impact of that reduction could be dramatic. According to Oxfam, reducing the consumption of the wealthiest 10% of the population to the European Union average would reduce annual carbon emissions by over a quarter. We can't expect developing countries to reduce fossil fuel consumption as they try to develop, and we shouldn't, which is something I keep saying in all of the circles that I operate in. But cleaner growth strategies offer hope that their development will be less energy intensive than their predecessors. For example, Nicaragua has been able to develop alternative energy sources such that 72% of total electricity demand is met by renewable sources. But I want to emphasize, and this is an important point, especially in VC and tech circles, and something I want to emphasize, that we can't rely on engineered solutions to fight climate change. They aren't developing with the speed, scalability, and consequence-free landscape that would be necessary. And even if they were, especially the silver bullet theories around cheap renewable energy, they would almost certainly not have the desired effect. Jevons's paradox has repeatedly shown us that increased energy efficiency has actually driven increased demand for energy, resulting in a net increase in emissions. This is one of our biggest issues. We think there's a magic bullet. There really isn't. So if we do have to change behavior to lower emissions, how can we make it successful? Past attempts, and there's lots of behavior change models. We're showing you one. It's called the ABC model. Past attempts have focused on appealing to people's values, but these have largely produced disappointing results. In fact, beliefs often don't translate into action, and actions may not even have the desired effect if not carefully considered. Instead, we have to meet consumers where they are, making behavior change as easy and frictionless as possible. That means thinking much more broadly and creatively about what investing in sustainability means. Software, we think, has a huge potential to shape human behavior, and the companies here already have. And I make no comment here as to whether these four named companies are doing that for good or for not good. The point is, software works at global scale at very low cost. It provides versatile design options and the possibility for quick iteration. And as I said, it has vast reach. In summary, the climate crisis is largely a crisis of overconsumption, mostly in the developed world and among the affluent. Engineering wizardry alone will not solve this problem. It will take behavior change at scale. Software has immense capacity to trigger this behavior change, and that's why we at Amasia invest in early stage software and software-enabled companies that catalyze changes in behavior to enhance sustainability and mitigate global impact, climate impact. Thank you for your time.